Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. The main purpose of this show is to promote a discussion of major international issues such as war and peace, economic and social development, climate change, and human rights that impact people worldwide. New knowledge will inspire, involve, and motivate all of us to better deal with these challenges and to help create a better world. Today's program is going to focus upon the issue of human rights and what one organization is doing to try to shine the spotlight on these human rights violations. We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're going to take a look at human rights violations and what Human Rights Watch is doing to help us identify these violations and hopefully make some changes. My guest today is an expert on this topic and this organization. My guest today is Akshaya Kumar, who is the Deputy United Nations Director at Human Rights Watch. Previously, Ms. Kumar was the Sudan and South Sudan Policy Analyst at the Enough Project. Akshaya Kumar, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you for having me, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me today. Let's jump right into it. What is the Human Rights Watch? When was it formed? Why was it formed?
Well, Human Rights Watch is a nonprofit organization, and we really focus on investigating, exposing, and hopefully changing the situation for people who are experiencing and affected by human rights abuses. And we were formed back in the late 70s, actually with a very narrow focus on something called the Helsinki Accords. And so we were called Helsinki Watch, and we're looking at the implementation of those accords which promised civil and political rights to people in the former Soviet bloc states. But since then, we expanded our mission. We became more global. We took on the Americas in the 80s and Africa and Asia later after that, and so became Human Rights Watch in 1988.
And of course, you're a 501c3 organization. You're tax exempt, which means people can donate to you if they would like. They can also learn more about your organization by going to www.hrw.org, HRW being for Human Rights Watch, and focus on some of the programs that you have and some of the projects and some really interesting studies that you've done. Let's talk about human rights in general. If we think about human rights, if we had 5 or 6 people in the room here, we'd probably have 5 or 6 different definitions of human rights. Do you have a broad definition of human rights? Are there subcategories of human rights? Are we all endowed with human rights simply because we were born and we are humans on the planet? Or how do you define that?
Well, we do believe that we're all endowed with rights, but at our organization, we like to take a very legal approach to pushing for human rights. And the reason we do that is because governments make promises, they sign on to treaties, and they pledge that they're going to uphold certain conventions. And so we really like to hold them to those promises. And so in the realm of civil and political rights, we look to the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. And we also look at conventions on things like torture or women's rights. But we always go back to the real legal instrument. Human Rights Watch also looks with an equal hand at economic, social, and cultural rights. We have divisions that focus on things like health and human rights, climate change, children's rights, and so we really take a broad approach to the question. And the last thing, and this is sort of an innovation, I think, actually, of our organization, is we've embraced using international humanitarian law, which is the law that governs armed conflict, to also look at human rights violations and violations against people who are living through conflicts.
And there are 6 organs of the United Nations. The UN Security Council is the most important. It has 5 permanent members: the United States, Russia, China, the UK, and France, and then 10 rotating members. But the resolutions that come through the United Nations Security Council are binding on the member state or the state or whatever the actor is that is being directed towards. How do you, one of your responsibilities is to interact with the UN Security Council. Why is it important, first off, for you to bring this human rights issue to the Security Council, and how do you do that?
Well, we really think that the Security Council, as you said, the most powerful UN organ, has an incumbent responsibility to put human rights at the center of its work. Although the Council is sort of explicitly tasked with maintaining international peace and security, it's our argument, and I think it's borne out by the facts around the world, that if you don't protect and promote human rights, you're not going to have neither peace nor security. And so we really take that argument to the 5 permanent members, as well as the 10 rotating elected members, to argue that they bring human rights right into the discussions of how they're going to approach and tackle these issues and what the solutions look like.
Have they started to do that? Are there cases, specific examples of where they're bringing the whole discussion of human rights into it? Not just a matter of separating conflicting parties, not warring parties to stop them from killing each other, but also with peacekeeping missions, what I'm going at, but also to bring the whole human rights discussion into the Security Council?
They definitely have, and in the past decade especially, we've seen a real emergence of human rights as a central element of the discussion. Now the Security Council gets briefings from the UN's own human rights experts, often the High Commissioner for Human Rights, who's now Prince Zaid, but also from civil society, actually. And the impact of that is really evident in a couple of situations. One that comes to mind is the Central African Republic, where the Security Council, in large part because of the human rights abuses that were happening in that small African country, decided to deploy a UN peacekeeping mission there, and more recently has decided to put its weight and support behind the creation and operationalization of a special criminal court to prosecute those people who were responsible for the abuses and violations that we were originally talking about. Another example is the situation in Burundi, where we've seen the Security Council really put a focus on human rights as a part of the problem, and not just focus on a political issue, but also on the rights of the Burundians themselves.
It's often been said that, or I've read in the past, that no country in the world has a perfect human rights record. Now, many countries are better than a lot of other countries, so it's a relative situation, I guess, in comparison to country X and country Y. Do you agree that no country has a perfect human rights record? Is that a fair assumption?
I think that's completely fair. And it is true that no country has a perfect human rights record. We see that through the Universal Periodic Reviews, which take place in Geneva, where every single country in the world is subject to the same kinds of scrutiny, the same kinds of questions about whether or not they're upholding rights, whether it's the United States or Saudi Arabia, North Korea, or France. We at Human Rights Watch have documented serious human rights abuses in all of those countries. In fact, we operate in about 90 countries globally, and we publish a world report every year that looks into the human rights situation and points to the fact that no one's perfect, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep pushing them to do better.
And we're going to come back to the Universal Periodic Review very shortly. That is so important. That's now been adopted at the UN. But before we move away from some of these countries, North Korea is a country that's constantly, it seems like, on the front pages of the newspapers for one reason or another. What is the situation as far as the Security Council incorporating the human rights element in dealing with North Korea?
North Korea is definitely one of the stickier situations. For years and years and years, the Security Council has really looked at this particular country through the lens of peace and security, and specifically nuclear nonproliferation. So the Council will hold emergency meetings to respond to every new nuclear launch by the North Koreans, but they are very reluctant to talk about the human rights situation there. But we've been able to crack through that in the past couple of years. And so beginning in December 2014, it was an uphill battle. And in fact, there was actually a procedural vote to see whether or not it was even allowed to have this type of a conversation at the UN. But we were successful in getting the Council to actually look at the human rights situation in North Korea, not just that December, but also most recently in December 2015. And we're hopeful that they'll keep up that record by holding a similar session in December 2016.
Another issue that many observers feel is probably the number one problem we're dealing with in the world today is climate change. We see that the glaciers are melting, the oceans are rising, desertification's taking place. You see that the climatic conditions are changing quite dramatically. People are being dislocated. There are climate change refugees, people who are on the move, millions more who will be on the move in the future, in the not too distant future. Are you bringing human rights, the whole human rights discussion into this issue of climate change? And if so, how do you do that? How do you bring it in to talk about how climate changing adversely affects people's human rights, and their human rights could affect other people's human rights?
Of course, yeah. This is something we've been focusing on increasingly, and we do it at two levels. At the very local level, our researchers have started to look at climate change as a potential source of human rights abuses, and also, of course, at government responses and to environmental protection situations as a way to really identify where people's human rights are being infringed by the changing climate. But we also take a look at these issues at the intergovernmental level. And so we had representatives in Paris when the climate change treaty, which was recently discussed and negotiated, was put together. And our focus was doing exactly this, getting the notion that climate change creates human rights abuses and that people have a right actually to a clean and healthy environment right there in the center of the discussion. So people remember that climate change is not something that states can opt into or opt out of as far as intergovernmental treaties. It's something they're actually obliged to address because they have to on behalf of their citizens whose human rights are being infringed.
This is not an option.
That's right.
They have to do it because it's going to affect them. There's no way they can get away from it. I often think of there's so many cases around the world where you see the climate changing, as I mentioned a few of them, but one in particular, we see that the glaciers are melting in the Himalayas, in the Andes Mountains in South America. And so often you see pictures of people, indigenous people who live in the Altiplano, the high areas of the Amazon or the Andean region, and their glaciers, it's predicted that within 10, 15, 20 years, they will be gone. And what will happen at that point in time when the glaciers are gone, the water supply is gone, what will happen to those people? What do you think, what types of human rights, if we could kind of flash out into the future, what types of human rights problems do you see developing there in this theoretical situation?
Well, you know, it's theoretical, but it's also a real reality for people. And so whether you think about the Andes or the Himalayas or Turkana in Kenya, where our researchers have done extensive work, or the Marshall Islands, for example, which have a real concern of actually going completely underwater in a couple of years, there are real human rights dimensions to the challenge of climate change. And so we're talking basically about all of your rights being at risk if governments aren't able to take decisive action to stop or at least try to slow this changing global climate. And that is something that we're going to remain deeply concerned about and follow closely.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately financed, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections Television are solely those of the moderator and his guest. Our viewers are invited to check out the website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous shows. If you're interested in distributing our shows through PBS, Community Access Television, educational institutions, a website, or any other media outlets, please go to our website for more information. Global Connections Television is provided as a public service at no cost. Today we're taking a look at the human rights situation in many areas of the world and what Human Rights Watch is doing. My guest is an expert on both of these, the issues and the organization. My guest today is Ms. Akshaya Kumar. Akshaya Kumar is the Deputy United Nations Director at Human Rights Watch. Akshaya, we're talking about human rights in general. There's so many areas that you could be focusing upon. You don't have a staff of thousands, I'm sure. You're not that large. No other organization does. How do you prioritize? How do you determine, very briefly, where you're going to focus your attention? You have a certain number of personnel who could look at these issues, but how do you identify them? Do you just prioritize them and then pick the top five, or how do you do that?
Well, we're lucky to have about 400 staff who are in offices around the world, and in large part, our researchers tell us what to focus on. They're experts on their countries. They often live in those countries and are deeply embedded in the civil society networks there, and so they look at the situation and do their research and document abuses, and they inform us. You know, these are the big issues in our countries that we need to be looking at. As an advocate here at the UN, we also allow ourselves to be guided by the pressing issues in front of the UN Security Council. And so I mentioned Burundi earlier, and I think it's a great example of how our advocacy has been able to push an issue on the agenda. And now in the next couple weeks, we're hopeful that the Security Council will pass a resolution to respond to the growing threat against the average Burundian people by their own security services, by deploying a UN police mission there.
You mentioned the situation with some of these particular countries and how important it is to focus on these particular countries. And I'm thinking back too with not only the countries but also some events that have taken place. 2015 was a banner year at the United Nations with, you mentioned the Paris Agreement on climate change, but also the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted. 17 logical, practical, achievable, measurable Sustainable Development Goals to eliminate poverty, to eliminate hunger, to promote women's equality, gender equality, those types of things. Are there certain goals of those 17 that you're focused? I'm sure all 17 are important, but are there one or two that really are more of a driving force in what you do and how you develop your work plan and what you focus on?
Well, we know that the Sustainable Development Goals are going to be a big part of conversations at the UN for years to come. And all 17, indeed, are incredibly important. Many of them speak to economic, social, and cultural rights. And many of them sort of point to the fact that these goals are not just aspirational, they're also rooted in obligations that states have to their own citizens and their people. So when we have indicators and when we have measures to track whether or not a country's achieving these goals, that's not just a benchmark to say, okay, how far along are you to this aspiration? It's also a benchmark to show, well, which rights are really being protected and preserved. As far as choosing goals, it's difficult, but I think one of the big goals that I focus on, particularly because of my work with the Security Council, is Goal 16, which looks at both peace and justice. And of course, that's integral to our push often to secure accountability for human rights abuses that are committed and violations of the laws of war in places like Syria or Yemen, where the Saudi Arabia coalition has been conducting bombing raids for the past year.
And of course, that was a major issue at the UN not long ago with this whole situation of human rights in Yemen, human rights being violated. What is the status of that today with Saudi Arabia?
Well, you know, one of the sort of hottest and biggest discussions at the UN in the past couple of days has been this issue of children's rights in Yemen. And this Secretary General, based on the reporting of his own SRSG, Leila Zerougi, and her monitoring and reporting team, decided that the Saudi-led Arab coalition, who have been fighting against the Houthis in Yemen, deserve to be listed on what's called the UN's Children's Rights List of Shame. There's only a few governments who are on this list, but the Secretary General decided that the abuses against kids in Yemen, the bombings of schools and hospitals, the killing and maiming of children was just so significant that he couldn't stand by without putting the Saudis on this list. Unfortunately, what Saudi Arabia was able to do is use its power and influence and a huge financial threat to get itself taken off the list. And so Ban Ki-moon, we believe very reluctantly, the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said that he was temporarily removing the Saudis from this list. And right now we're in limbo. We don't know if he's going to change his mind based on reviewing the facts and put them back on, or if the Saudis, let's all hope, will actually take some steps towards protecting the rights of children and stop their indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas. Even though some countries say they don't worry about being on any type of list, it makes no difference. But does it really not make a difference if you're on a list? If you're identified 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or however many of doing something that perhaps is not
the proper thing to do, does that not impact that country and its ability to interact with other countries and perhaps impact that country politically, socially, culturally, economically, from the tourism standpoint, just on across the board?
We definitely think it does, and that's why Human Rights Watch's methodology is sort of rooted in this idea of naming and shaming human rights violators and abusers. And if anything, what the Saudi-led coalition's real push to get off this list has shown us, on one hand, of course, it's shown us that the UN is susceptible to political and financial pressure. But I think the more important lesson is that even a country like Saudi Arabia, incredibly powerful, incredibly wealthy, a regional leader in its own right, still believes that they want to stay on, the good graces of something like the United Nations. They definitely don't want to be singled out on a list of shame that has some really atrocious human rights abusers all around the world on it.
Well, Akshaya Kumar with the Human Rights Watch, this is a fascinating topic. It's one that is so extremely important. Unfortunately, we're going to have to cut it a few minutes short, but I would encourage all of our viewers to go look at the Universal Periodic Review that does apply to all the countries of the world. And this, of course, is a major change that was made by the UN in 2005. But these topics are so very, very important. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed today's program. Please join us again for the next episode of Global Connections Television. I'm Bill Miller. Thanks for watching.